Hello, it's Martin from Wisely Automotive and it's the last day of Fully Charged 2022. In case you couldn't make it, I will show you a couple of interesting cars, some of which have not been available last year. With that said, enough talking because it's about to start raining. So, let's get on with it. Starting the same way as the last year with the Nissan Ariya. The cars on display are still marked as prototypes, but it is now actually possible to sit in them and even test drive them. I managed to get the infotainment fired up. It seems much better than any other previous Nissan, with a more modern UI, and I believe it runs all on Android. The screen is weirdly fuzzy though. I don't think this comes across on video, but it seems like there is a very strong anti-reflective coating underneath the glass, making the image quite soft. On the steering wheel, the buttons are implemented as single physical buttons with multiple light-up zones. This makes them still tactile but probably cuts a bit of cost, and it looks very sleek, so I personally can get on board with this implementation. Speaking of buttons, most are integrated under the hood, just like in the BMW iX. They do create quite realistic feedback. The only problem is that if you want to tap a button very quickly without releasing your hand from the surface, the car still seems a bit confused about that. Hopefully that's something which can be fixed with software. Using set buttons reveals the motorized shelf. Nissan's idea is that you can place an iPad or a laptop on there and do some work while you are charging. It's definitely a cool concept, but we will see how many people actually use it and how long the additional moving parts last. The other motorized bit is the center console, which when slid back really opens up the cabin and reveals the almost completely flat floor. In terms of materials and the design, the front is nice as expected. The bigger question is the situation in the back. So if I move there, you can see that I've got really good legroom, good headroom, an option for heated outer seats, air vents in the middle, decent thigh support, and still nice and premium soft touch materials on tops of the door cards. Coming around to the boot, there are two layers of underfloor storage, and if you look carefully, it seems like the 12-volt battery is hiding all the way in the back here as well. In terms of additional storage under the bonnet, there is none. If you're not familiar, despite it being a dedicated EV platform, it is front-wheel drive by default with an option of all-wheel drive, so this is where the motor, the power electronics and the HVAC system lives. And good news, finally a CCS port on a Nissan. Next up, the Ford Mustang Mach-e GT. The Mach-e was on display last year already, but GT is the version which does 0 to 60 in about 3.7 seconds. Visually they are very similar, the main differences are in slightly revised body kit and more sporty looking wheels. Before I jump inside, I still find it fascinating to this day how thick the battery is, which results in absolutely massive looking side sills and only about 13.5 centimeters of ground clearance on this lowered GT version. What I would say is the biggest upgrade on the GT, even possibly better than the performance, are the seats. They offer very good side support, they look much nicer, and are quite an improvement over the very flat standard seats. I still insist that the fit and finish could be a bit nicer on the interior, but I can at least confirm that the infotainment seems a lot more responsive, so it seems like Ford has managed to fix some of the early software issues. As I make my way further to the back, I notice that the Ora Cat is on display. Please don't skip, this car is actually quite a bit more important than it may seem on the surface. In case you're not familiar, Ora is a new sub-brand of a Chinese car maker, Great Wall. The reason why I'm saying this car is important is not only because it should arrive in the UK somewhere just above £25,000, but the new electric Mini will be built in conjunction with Great Wall. With that out of the way, let's look at the car itself. I never quite realized from the press photos, but if you look very closely, you can see that there are textured hexagons in the front bumpers as an interesting design touch. The charge port is in the front wing. It is CCS, but it has these terrible secondary covers. Looking under the wing mirrors, there is a camera, so the Cat should have a surround view at least as an option. The stitch details in the interior are not exactly my cup of tea, but this hair-spec example seems to be quite well equipped with electric seats and adaptive LED headlights, for example. There is a rotary drive selector in the middle, which honestly could do with a bit more fine-tuning because it did feel quite cheap. Mini-style toggle switches, and surprisingly nice materials for the budget on the top of the dashboard. And that's how I would summarize this car. It's nice, but I think it could still be a little bit better by just changing the styling a bit without necessarily spending more on more expensive parts. And it obviously gets cheaper the lower down you go. The steering wheel feels a bit thin, but at the end of the day, it's all fine. Jumping into the back, there is surprisingly a lot of room for a Super Mini. The materials in the door cards are significantly cheaper than in the front, but I still have very good kneeroom and headroom, so even a longer journey would be possible here. All of the rear seat space comes at the cost of the boot space though. This is probably the world's tiniest parcel shelf, right next to something like a Fiat 500. You do have a tiny bit of underfloor storage, but practicality is compromised by having to load things over this huge lip. I think the final price will be the determining factor of how successful this car is. Now the Honda E probably doesn't need any introduction, but I never actually got a chance to sit in one. I personally really like it in this high-vis color with the two-tone finish, but I do appreciate most people would probably want something a bit more subtle. The charging port is located in a cutout in the bonnet, so to see what's underneath I actually have to unplug the car first and then lift the bonnet up. It does have gas struts, but despite the vehicle being rear-wheel drive there is not much to see and no storage space at all. Closing that back up, as I said, it's a rear-wheel drive car and Honda has decided to go for a staggered wheel setup. If you're not familiar with that terminology, I would recommend watching the video we made on the i3 wheels, but basically it means that the rear wheels are wider than the fronts and they come with Michelin Pilot Sport 4 tires, which is a very good choice in our opinion. In the front I didn't manage to turn on the dual screen infotainment, but sitting inside gave me a chance to notice that there is no middle armrest whatsoever. Otherwise the interior gives very i3-esque vibes with the wood on the dash, the two-spoke steering wheel, the clever use of eco-friendly materials and the frameless windows. In the rear I did manage to fit behind myself, which I would consider an achievement for such a small car, but it's still only a 4-seater, just like the i3. The material quality is still decent, but it feels like you are sitting low to the floor, which would definitely not be comfortable on a long journey. Opening the boot, this is of course only a manual tailgate, and if I remove the dummy luggage, you see the really small dimensions, further compromised by the bulky rear wheel arches, not helped by a very shallow underfloor cubby. Also, no split folding on the rear bench, so you can either take a decent amount of cargo and only one additional passenger, or 4 people in total, but not much cargo. The next stand is Kia and they have 2 cars which we need to discuss. The EV6 was only on a static display last year, but I actually managed to get onto a test drive. I start out in eco mode where the car defaults to being rear-wheel drive only. This is quite interesting because the EV6 uses 2 permanent magnet motors, so there must be a clutch in the front one to allow freewheeling. The paddle shifters on the steering wheel can be used for altering the regen strength. The car creeps by default, but regen can be increased all the way to I-pedal, which enables one-pedal driving. Despite the brakes being software blended, they are very smooth and linear regardless of which mode you are in. Just like any other high-end Kia, a blind spot camera appears in the instrument cluster when you turn on the respective indicator. As I get onto the open road, I switch to the sport mode. This engages the front motor as well, creating essentially permanent all-wheel drive with very responsive immediate power delivery. The handling balance is definitely tuned a bit softer than Tesla's, but without a significant compromise on body control. Somewhere between a Model 3 and Model Y in terms of perceived size, which makes sense given you sit slightly higher up, but this definitely isn't an SUV. Plus, with the shallow boot and relatively low rear bench, this I would describe as a slightly raised up Model 3 with a hatchback. I'm comparing it to a Tesla because other than the Model 3 and Y, which I would still rank as my #1 EVs overall, the EV6 is a very close second. And for anyone not wanting a Tesla for whatever reason, but looking for a car of this size, it's easy to recommend based on the good overall packaging, excellent brake and drivetrain calibration, handling, if not flashy but robust infotainment system, and generous equipment for the money, especially with the mid-spec GT line. The second Kia to discuss is the Niro EV. The facelifted Niro now gets a new front bumper, giving it a lot more distinct look. The entire light cluster is a single unit on each side, with the daytime running light lining the bottom edge, dipped and high beam projectors in the middle, and only an accent eyebrow over the headlight. Said accent trim continues into the middle and is patterned so it looks quite smart in person. The charge port is now located right in the middle as well. I know some people like it in the front, but I think it's safer and more convenient to back into a spot, plus not so much of a UK problem, but at countries with snow, it means it will get clogged up in the winter. With the bland exterior of the previous generation fixed, I'm keen to see the interior in person, because that's the second area which started looking a bit dated. The front door cards are soft on the top half and hard on the bottom half, but even then, it's this textured, almost carbon fiber looking like material. A really clever way of using something cheaper than padded panels without looking cheap at all. I didn't manage to turn on the infotainment, but I would assume it's the same as the EV6 I just drove. Similarly, the steering wheel is the same as on that car as well, with paddles for adjusting region, physical buttons, and a dedicated drive mode button. The front seats on this top spec version are electrically adjustable and ventilated, very rare in this price range. The rear seats are what we already know from Niro's. Good knee room, headroom and thigh support thanks to the quite upright seating position. The door cards here are definitely more plasticky than the ones in the front, but it's not offensive and the armrest is still padded. Going back, let's address the contrasting roof pillar. It is an option and can be had in either body color, grey or black. The bottom side skirts are always contrasting though. Removing the window definitely has a purpose though, because there are now air channels underneath the panel, which should help with aerodynamic efficiency a little bit. Moving to the boot, you get this lightweight and flexible cover, some storage under the floor, and now a powered tailgate on the highest trim level. Last thing, just for completeness, I wanted to check what's under the bonnet, and it's a pleasant surprise. Despite being a front-wheel drive car on a platform used by hybrids, Kia managed to squeeze in a frunk. Just goes to show that some companies really put proper effort into building a good product. Speaking of cars with combustion engines which are converted well into electric, the Volvo C40. The C40 is practically a coupe version of the XC40, a compact SUV. It has some new design elements like a revised grille cover, and overall the bumper is a bit sleeker. These will trickle down to the XC40 as well in the form of a facelift. I believe the drivetrain is identical to the Polestar 2, but because the car is a bit taller, it gives you a bit more interior space. It can be felt in the rear despite the sloping roofline, and the deep footwells, thanks to the batteries being placed in what normally would be the transmission and prop shaft tunnel, means you can slide your feet under the front seats. Plus the full glass roof on this example definitely helps with the feeling of space. In the front, the steering wheel and switchgear is again identical to the Polestar, with the exception of being matte rather than glossy. Maybe not as nice in the brochure, but definitely more practical in the real life. However, I can't help but feel that the infotainment display is a bit small by 2022 standards. But also, just like the Polestar, it does run on the Android Automotive platform, which makes it super snappy, plus you can use Google Maps for navigation. The decorative trims complete the modern look. A big improvement over the Polestar 2 is that the center console isn't as wide, allowing you to spread out without as much of a sacrifice in comfort. And just like I hinted before, Volvo took the efforts to organize the components under the bonnet in such a way to squeeze in a small weathertight storage compartment as well. Next up, the BMW i4, which I spent quite a bit of time on because as an i3 specialist we often get asked about what we think about the current electric BMW lineup. Visually, it definitely can be polarizing. So let's address the front grille. It looks fine in person. Can't say I love it, but it definitely wouldn't deter me from buying the car. If you look closely, the grille really is there for aesthetic reasons only, because the air intake with the active air shutters and the radar sensor is only in the very bottom section of the bumper. This particular example is the top-of-the-line M50 version. It's still a BMW though, so if you want these fancy features like for example the laser headlights, they are an optional add-on. While I'm here, I can also point out that all the side air intakes are real. So in the front bumper to create air curtains over the front wheels, and they slot in the wheel arch to reduce the pressure and let the air out on the side of the car. Said frameless doors reveal that all the side windows are only single glazed. Inside, the M seats look fantastic. Fully electrically adjustable, and for a sporty car, really appreciate that the side bolsters can be inflated or deflated as needed. On the driver's side, you can really see what BMW were going for, with the curved dual displays making you feel like you are in a cockpit. I did play about with them briefly, and while you still do have the iDrive jog wheel, it definitely is a touch-first interface. I would say slowly get used to it, because it's only a question of time until the rotary controller goes on all BMW models. It is already happening on the low end. I'm also not too keen on the graphics in this generation of the operating system. I always viewed BMW as modern, clean and understated. Now they really turned up the flashiness, but personally it's a bit too close to feeling tacky. The steering wheel does have physical buttons, but why is it all the previous generation switchgear and not the style like the iX or even the 2 Series Active Tourer? Why do we still need a start-stop button? And a massive gear selector if it's drive-by-wire anyways. The head-up display, as difficult as it is to film, is quite small by 2022 standards, without any augmented reality. It just all feels a bit last gen. And that's before the car even launched in big numbers. Moving to the back. This was my biggest question, given the car is not built on a dedicated EV platform. And it's okay. I'm 6 feet and fit behind myself with just about enough knee room, headroom, and the seating position is quite similar to something like a Model 3. There's a big hump in the floor, so carrying 5 people is really pushing it. I suppose the biggest practicality advantages over a Model 3 will be that the i4 has a bigger boot opening, compatibility with roof racks, and an optional tow hitch all at the same time. That used to be the case on the Tesla, but since the Model Y has been introduced, you can't get the tow attachment for the 3 anymore. And the obligatory check under the bonnet reveals a ton of wasted space, like in the iX3. This is just lazy, and that's how I would summarize the i4. It's definitely good and I'm sure it will sell well, but it could have been so much better, even on an internal combustion engine platform. On the VW side, the ID4 GTX is on display, which is the all-wheel drive and slightly spicier version of the ID4. What caught my eye though is the ID5, again basically just a coupe version of the ID4, but because it's a new model it ran the version 3 software. How do you know that without going into the menu? The UI is a bit revised, but the biggest giveaway is that battery state of charge in percentage is now always displayed in the instrument panel. Does it improve the system responsiveness? Well, not really. It's maybe a bit better than the version I tried last year, so definitely usable, but with this example having to push more pixels on the optional bigger display, it really could do with a faster processor. The fact remains though that despite maybe not being as exciting as the Hyundai or Kia products, these VW Group crossovers are fantastic family cars. Even with the sloping roof of the ID5, I have the most room in the back of all the cars I tried here, further helped by the glass roof, plus plentiful storage in the boot. I have already driven the ID3, so wanted to see how these bigger cars would compare. I managed to get a test drive on the Audi Q4 e-tron, specifically the 40 version. So probably what will be the bestseller in the UK, with the biggest battery pack but only a single motor on the rear axle. The first slightly odd thing is the hexagonal steering wheel. I do think it works in this case and does help with the visibility of the virtual cockpit instruments without a compromise on familiarity. I very quickly switched into the high regen B mode, but this definitely isn't one-pedal driving. The deceleration isn't as strong as on the Kia, for example, and even in B mode the car continues to creep at low speeds. Luckily, despite using blended brakes, the brake pedal does feel very natural and the drivetrain behaves smoothly even in low-speed maneuvering. Out on the road, it's what you would expect an Audi to be. Quiet, controlled, not necessarily super exciting, but it definitely can handle even well-spirited driving. What ruins this refinement are quite a few rattles. It probably doesn't come across in the video, but there is a nasty one coming from the head-up display dashboard area and a more subtle one in the back. Look, it's a single car, so we can't draw any conclusions, but it proves the point that no manufacturer is perfect, and if you expect all German cars to be solid out of the factory compared to something like a Tesla, you may be setting yourself up for disappointment. Lastly, I did adjust the head-up display later in the drive, which made it a bit more visible on video. The bottom area is static and shows driver assistance information, the speed, and so on. On top of that is the augmented reality area, which should project navigation arrows onto the road. But it didn't seem to work that well during my 20-minute drive, and they usually just mirrored the static navigation instructions. Overall, a nice car, but before recommending, I would definitely cross-shop between the Skoda Enyaq and the ID.4 or 5, which are all pretty much the same car underneath. Because despite this example being over £50,000, it didn't have adaptive cruise control, nor front parking sensors, or a reversing camera, which I would definitely expect in this price range. The last car to cover is the DS3. It's supposed to be the most premium out of all the compact crossovers in the Stellantis group. It's definitely well refined and leads on the side of comfort rather than sportiness. No problem with that, and I'm glad it brings a bit of variety to the market. I also need to mention that I was a passenger in the Peugeot E2008 last year, and I was really impressed for what it was. It is unfortunately a bit different from the driver's seat. As most modern cars, the steering is quite numb, but that's fine. The brakes and the drivetrain are the big problem. Like the previous cars I drove, DS uses blended brakes to let you choose between low and high regen modes. The difference is that the implementation is much worse. At low speeds, it feels like the car often forgets to start moving when you release the brake pedal, making it a bit unpredictable and just lurching forward. On the other hand, when using the brakes at higher speeds, especially when asking for a good amount of braking power, it feels like the physical brake pads bite a split second after the pedal is pressed. It may have been just a software glitch on this particular car, but it feels bizarre and doesn't inspire confidence. This is where one can see that the other manufacturers are at least on their second generation EVs, whereas the Stellantis group is still only starting out. I would like to know how the Fiat 500e compares, because even though Fiat now belongs under the same group, I would imagine most of the development was done during the time when Fiat and PSA were still separate. Unfortunately, didn't manage to get a test drive, as it is one of the cars which is in high demand. Bonus, there was an ID bus tucked in between all the trade booths, so I did wait for 20 minutes in the queue just to sit in it. Honestly, it's what you would expect in terms of seating position and space, but it's definitely not a bad thing. Oddly, there are no 3 proper seats in the second row, but more seating configurations, a long wheelbase version, and a camper are all supposedly coming in the future. Can't wait specifically for the camper version and the possibilities which will be unlocked by having a big high voltage battery integrated in the floor of the car. And I think that's about it. The show is about to close, so thank you very much for watching and see you in the next one.